Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be taking a look at a topic that is always a great debate in boardrooms these days, and that's the issue of board risk management oversight. And we're specifically going to be looking at sort of audit versus a risk committee and dig down deep into that topic. We have a very good panel here to help me sort of think through this topic. So let me introduce to my immediate right, Cindy Fornelli, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Audit Quality. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you, TK.
And to her right is John Foster, who's the Audit Chair for Masonite International Corp. Sits on 3 other audit committees and sits on the board of Chemtura, Lear, Berry Plastics, and Sabine Oil and Gas. And that's a big schedule, John, but it's a pleasure that you could work us in and be our guest on the show.
Don't be silly. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So before we get started, there's sort of a qualifying statement that we need to make, and that is that when we look at this topic, we know that there is not just a single practice or a best practice for managing and overseeing risk. It depends on skill sets of a board, the industry they're in, how they operate. So we're going to be discussing the principles that are key to any debate to talk about this. But we want to make sure that we qualify, that we understand that just because somebody does it different, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. We still hope that somebody goes through the thought processes of the principles. That being said, let me start by asking you guys just in general about risk management as a whole and the board's role with that. And Cindy, I'll start with you.
Great, thanks, TK. And what you just said, the qualifier, is so important that I'm going to reiterate it. And that is that not one size fits all. Each company, each board of directors does have to look at what that company is going through, what the skill sets of the board members are, how much time, what else the various committees have. So not only is it not one size fits all, I would posit that a board would have to reevaluate it periodically to make sure that where it is where it should lie at that particular time. And then the other point is regardless of where it is, I do think it's important as a principle that everybody acknowledges that it is the responsibility at the end of the day for the entire board. Yes, it can be delegated to a particular committee to do a deeper dive on, but at the end of the day, risk is something the entire board should be talking about because there are so many different kinds of risk.
Yeah, well, our deep dive will take a look at the issues that's presented by the challenge that the board has. John, how about your overview?
Well, Cindy was talking a little about where is risk. I would ask also, what is risk? And to me, risk really is, what is a company's risk appetite? Or how much risk are you willing to take to try to achieve your strategic objectives? And clearly risk is something that should be, and often is, I hope always is, talked about in detail and frequently, both at committee potentially, and certainly with the whole board. And while cyber risk has really raised this issue to the forefront beyond banks and retailers, even the manufacturing world, where I spend much of my time, has real risk. There is customer risk, supplier risk, risk of stolen technology. So risk is an increasingly important topic for all boards. That's really what it is. I know we're going to talk a little bit about where it should sit as well.
Well, and let me first give you some of my own views relative to the risk. I was always leery of the concept of forming another committee, another risk committee. I was leery because it sort of prompted the idea that whenever you had a challenge, you'd create another board committee, and we all know that that would get out of hand or whatever. But cyber risk for me has changed the game, okay? and I'm curious on your guys' thoughts. I have trouble putting cyber risk into the audit agenda. Not that audit isn't capable to do it, but there is so much in their current agenda at this point. So I need to have both your views on how cyber risk may or may not have changed the debate. And John, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's raised the visibility. When you see millions of customer data stolen from brand name banks and retailers, it raises the issue somewhat to the forefront. I don't think it necessarily should have. For example, I'm on the board of a company where we have tens of thousands of people in Mexico. That's a very significant risk. We've been trying to address that risk well. So the good news is, I think, cyber risk has raised the issue. I'm not sure it should have taken that to do so. I think that's a separate issue from where does it sit. I think that while the skill set on an audit committee often lends itself to handling risk, audit committees have very full agendas today. It's unusual today to have a separate risk committee, aside from banks and finance institutions where it's mandated by Dodd-Frank. About 9% of the S&P 500 has a separate risk committee. I think, again, there's no one-size-fits-all. One of the boards I'm on, we have the Nominating Governance Committee oversee risk. That's one of the 3 mandated committees. It's frequently not that busy, to be perfectly honest. And if the skill set is right, why not put it there? I might disagree with you a little bit. I'd suggest it belongs with the whole board. I think it's a core issue. And to me, it's very different to spend 90 minutes at a board meeting on risk as compared to just receiving a 10-minute update on what the risk committee did. But again, it's a little bit dependent on the facts and circumstances of a particular company, its capabilities, its time, and frankly, how mature its risk management process is.
So John, do you ever worry about when it's the responsibility of the whole board, what happens in between board meetings and sort of who owns that? That to me will be one of the critical issues. And cyber risk to me, isn't just a 90-minute, that there is so much that's going to happen. And look at all the work that the audit chair does or the comp chair does in between meetings. And if you assign it to sort of the whole board, who becomes the owner of it?
Well, I think if there's a very specific risk you're particularly concerned about, in your example, cyber risk, or perhaps in my prior example, thousands of people working in Mexico, which is unsettled, perhaps you should set up a committee focused on one issue. I know of a board that set up a manufacturing quality committee for a period of time. That was a core issue. So I'm not sure I agree with just defaulting to a risk committee. If there's a specific risk or two, set up a committee for a certain period of time and focus on it. If not, just like strategic planning, major acquisitions, I think the whole board should be involved in the overall risk issue.
Well, and of course, the whole company has to be involved too, right? There's a role for management in between to set up a framework and make sure the framework's being followed. And for the board or the committee that has been assigned to this to clearly state their expectations of when they want to be involved, when they want to be notified when something happens.
So Cindy, how about the cyber risk part? You certainly play in this space all day long. So what has this changed the debate in your mind?
I think it has. I think it's put a sharper focus on how much the audit committee has on its plate right now. You and I have had this conversation before, and that is the audit committee overburdened? Do they have too much on their plate? So can they take on something as big as cyber right now? And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the company and the board has to decide whether the audit committee has the capacity. One thing that I will say is that audit committees oftentimes are looking at things retrospectively, and I think with cyber you have to look prospectively. And so I don't know if that changes the dynamic or not. It depends on the boards and the audit committees and the risk committee's composition.
Cindy, that reminds me of this discussion about cyber risk. We receive a number of questions where somebody's asking sort of what's the role of the outside auditor in this cyber risk game. So maybe you're a great person to answer that for our audience.
Well, currently, the auditor's role is to provide assurances that the financial statements effectively are reliable in all material aspects. And so I think asking the robustness of a company's cyber risk is different than that. So unless it impacts the financial statements or internal controls, then it's not really something that the external auditor would be involved in unless it rises to a disclosure requirement. However, having said that, I think because this is such a big issue and so many people are struggling with it, I think more and more boards are contemplating, is there a role for the outside auditor to provide some kind of attestation services outside of the financial statement audit, and what would that look like?
And John, some of your firms actually hired your outside auditor to do tests and whatever within that space, right?
Yes, I've learned that some of the accounting firms have significant resources in this area, probably all of them. And in one situation I'm involved in, we hired an outside accounting firm to try to penetrate our system and to see where the weaknesses were, and then to make a rather detailed presentation to our board. Just one more thing to add on to the back of what Cindy said. I think it's important to remember that risk is much more than just cyber risk. Again, cyber risk has elevated this, but things like customer concentration, difficult geographies, supplier issues, there's a lot of risk to be worried about, to analyze, to monitor, to address, other than just cyber risk. So that's a very important and probably the most visible one today.
So we only had about a minute and a half left in our first session here. Risk is nothing new. I mean, let's move off the cyber risk for a minute. Risk in general is nothing new. It has always been and it always will be part of the strategic planning process. So isn't that where, if somebody has a process, if management has a process in doing that, the oversight of the board really becomes part of the standard process? It isn't anything abnormal. There's the argument against the risk committee that we should have been doing risk management all along in our planning. John?
We should have been doing a lot of things all along in our planning. We could talk about audit committee functions, certain ones of them, certain compensation committee functions. To me, planning and risk are very separate. I think planning is all about maximizing your strengths, minimizing your weaknesses, and trying to have a long-term strategy to maximize shareholder value. Risk is something, it's a series of things that can destroy value and very quickly. And having a separate focus on what are my 10 key risks, what's my plan to minimize them, and then having both management and the board oversee them, that's really smart. I think planning and risk management are very separate issues.
But what about the concept of your risk appetite? Risk reward is your biggest part of strategic planning. I can see the black swan events where the board has to do that, but isn't the rest of the risk involved in the normal planning of the organization?
No, I don't think so. I think they're related but separate. Go back to my tens of thousands of people in Mexico issue. I think there's two separate things. How much risk are you willing to take? And then how do you manage that risk? That's a related but separate issue from my long-term planning to maximize shareholder value.
Cindy, you have 30 seconds on this.
We're
going to agree to disagree, but go ahead.
Well, I think what's important is communication. So whatever the outcome is, and I know in our second segment we're going to do a deeper dive into that, you do have to have communication. So if it's in a committee, it has to be communicated. But I do think maybe cyber has put a sharper point on it, but these are issues that boards have struggled with since the beginning, I think. And so having a clear path, whether it's Jonathan's framework, that first you talk about your risk, then you talk about how you mitigate it, and then you look at how does that fit into planning is one way to do it. And certainly I know a lot of boards do that.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately we're out of time on our first part, and that's why we're making this a two-part, because we haven't even touched the surface, okay, on this. So that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. Join us, we're going to take a look at part two, and hopefully this is all helping you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you next week.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.